Hello, everyone. My name is Brianna Seth, and I'm the Accessible Ohio Specialist for the Northeast region of the state. I am also a certified Americans with Disabilities Act coordinator and an occupational therapist. Today's presentation is on utilizing ADA tools.
And my name is Brian Crowe. I am the Business Relations Specialist in the Northeast region. We plan for accessibility from the start. For example, we use the accessibility checker that is built into Microsoft 365 to review the resource guide and PowerPoint. We address color contrast, font style and size, and alternative text, known as alt text, to visual images. Also in our delivery, we mention each other by name as a conversation goes back and forth to indicate who is speaking. This can be helpful when attendees are receiving this information through services like American Sign Language interpretation and live captioning. We edit the transcript and fix any captioning errors before uploading the webinar to our on-demand library. We also include a reasonable accommodation statement in our invitation to the webinar, so if attendees need an accommodation, they know who to contact to ask. Taking these steps up front can make this presentation more accessible and inclusive for everyone. Brianna, will you share an overview of today's webinar?
Sure. The purpose of today's webinar is to recognize how Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA tools, can assist you along your accessibility journey. We are first going to identify 3 tools available to assist in making environments accessible. Then we will describe how to use each of these tools and highlight ways they can complement one another. Lastly, we will wrap things up by providing examples of how communities and workplaces can apply these tools to their environments.
Thanks, Brianna. Before we identify the ADA tools available to assist with making environments accessible, let's take a moment to consider what the term accessibility means. We will start with an overview of accessibility by considering what it is, why it matters, and then identify the resources available to help create accessible environments. Brianna, would you like to start with what accessibility is?
Sure. Accessibility refers to removing barriers in the physical built environment and in the digital virtual environment to provide equitable access and usability to individuals with disabilities. Today's webinar is going to focus on access to the physical built environment. We have webinars in our on-demand library related to digital accessibility, accessible communications, and website accessibility. These can be accessed at no cost on OOD's employer webinar webpage. So Brian, can you touch on some of the many reasons accessibility matters?
I'd be happy to. People with disabilities make up the largest minority group in the country. According to the Centers for Disease Control, or CDC, approximately 1 in 4 adults in the United States has some type of a disability. Individuals with disabilities are our family members, friends, coworkers, employees, and ourselves. Disability touches all of our lives, and it matters to everyone that our environment is welcoming and inclusive. Individuals with disabilities are also customers. Accessibility benefits everyone and can have positive impacts on organizations. Studies show that hiring individuals with disabilities and prioritizing workplace inclusion leads to increased productivity, decreased turnover, improved morale, and higher revenues. The Employer Assistance and Resource Network on Disability, or EARN, reports that individuals with disabilities make up the 3rd largest market segment in our country. When a business creates environments, products, and services with accessibility in mind, it helps create an inclusive brand image. This can show the business values everyone, and it helps attract this incredibly valuable market segment. It becomes clear when we make things like services, communication, and environments accessible, everyone benefits. So how can we create an accessible environment for employees, visitors, customers, and guests?
Brian, we can create accessible environments by using accessible design. Accessible design focuses on removing barriers and providing access to individuals with disabilities. The concept of accessible design is informed by the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, and the 2010 ADA Standards for Accessible Design, known as the Standards, provided by the U.S. Department of Justice. So let's take a deeper look at the ADA. The ADA is a civil rights law that makes it unlawful to discriminate against individuals with disabilities in all facets of public life. The ADA has 5 titles that address access to work, school, transportation, and public places. Title I of the ADA makes it unlawful to discriminate against individuals with disabilities in all aspects of employment and requires covered employers to provide reasonable accommodations to individuals with disabilities when needed. Title II of the ADA prohibits discrimination based on disability in programs, services, and activities offered to the public by state and local governments. A couple examples of this include places of public education, public transportation, and public libraries. Title III of the ADA prohibits discrimination based on disability in commercial facilities and places of public accommodation. Examples of this include businesses and nonprofit organizations like restaurants, movie theaters, and recreational facilities. Title IV of the ADA addresses access to telecommunications and television, and Title V of the ADA contains miscellaneous provisions which apply broadly across all the ADA titles. The tools we are going to discuss today apply to entities with responsibilities under Titles II and III of the ADA, but they are helpful for everyone to use.
That's right, Brianna. Today we are going to discuss 3 ADA tools which can assist with creating accessible environments. We are going to start by introducing the 2010 ADA Standards for Accessible Design. Then we will discuss the ADA checklist for existing facilities and the Guide to ADA Accessibility Standards as complementary resources. These resources are all available online and are included in the resource guide for this webinar. Brianna, I think it's a good time to introduce these tools and describe their purpose.
All right, the 2010 ADA Standards for Accessible Design, known as the Standards, are really the foundation of accessible design. They are published and enforced by the U.S. Department of Justice and apply to entities with responsibilities under Titles II and III of the ADA. They set minimum requirements for newly designed and constructed or altered state and local government facilities, public accommodations, and commercial facilities to be readily accessible and usable by persons with disabilities. They are also a reference for making built environment changes to facilities for better accessibility and for removing barriers which are readily achievable. It's helpful to understand how the standards are organized and where you can find the information you need. The standards includes introductory information and 10 chapters. The introductory language provides information specific to the application of the standards for entities covered under Title II and Title III. Chapter 1 provides information on the application and administration of the standards. It outlines things like the purpose of the standards and provides information on aspects like dimensions for adults and children, reference standards such as the International Building Code, and definitions of terms used throughout the document. Chapter 2 covers the scoping requirements, and these requirements provide information on when and where the standards apply and provide some general exceptions. It also outlines what is needed and how many are needed. For an example, it provides guidance for where and how many accessible parking spaces are required. Chapters 3 through 10 describe the technical requirements for the built environment. Chapter 3 begins with the building blocks, which are the components that apply to the remaining chapters and include items like floor and ground surfaces, turning space, reach ranges, and more. Chapters 4 through 10 describe the technical requirements for specific aspects of the built environment, like accessible routes, communication elements, recreation facilities, and more. So let's keep with the example of parking. In Chapter 5, which addresses general site and building elements, You will find guidance for the dimensions of accessible parking spaces. Another resource available to support the accessibility journey is the ADA checklist for existing facilities provided by the New England ADA Center. This tool helps organizations assess the accessibility of their built environment. The checklist is based on the standards and contains 4 priorities. Priority 1 is approach and entrance, which considers things like parking, accessible routes, ramps, and more. Priority 2 is access to goods and services. This priority contains information on aspects of the environment, such as accessible routes, interior doors, seating, and signs. Priority 3 is toilet rooms, which considers aspects of accessible restrooms. And lastly, priority 4 is additional access, and this reviews things like drinking fountains and fire alarms. There are also recreational checklists for certain topics like amusement rides, swimming pools, and golf facilities.
So, Brianna, can businesses use the checklist to ensure they are accessible?
Well, Brian, the checklist is based on the information from the standards, but it does not contain the entirety of it. So it's important to also reference the standards. Let me share more about the checklist and how it can be a helpful resource. In each priority area, the checklist poses questions about the environment to help identify barriers. Sometimes it provides information from the standards, like measurements, to help with evaluating aspects of the environment. For an example, in Priority 2, the Access to Goods and Services checklists asks if there's a route at least 36 inches wide between checkout lanes. The checklist offers a space to record the measurement and an opportunity to answer yes or no to the question. It also has spaces to add comments and photos. In the last column, it provides information which can help with removing the barriers identified.
Brianna, the last column you mentioned relates to overcoming the identified barriers in the environment. Our next resource can help with this. The Guide to ADA Accessibility Standards, or the Guide, is provided by the United States Access Board. It takes requirements provided in the standards and organizes them by topic into chapters. The guide has descriptions, pictures, animations, and videos to describe the guidance from the standards using plain, easy to understand language. Like we mentioned with the checklist, the guide does not contain all of the requirements in the standards, so it is important to always refer back to the standards. Brianna, can you explain how the guide can be used?
Of course. The guide contains many subset guides which are specific to aspects in the standards. For example, Chapter 7 provides information about signage, including the scoping and technical requirements. The guide hyperlinks to the reference standards.
That is helpful, Brianna. So if organizations are looking for guidance specific to accessible routes or parking spaces, they can visit that guide for more information.
That's right, Brian. But as always, reference the standards along with the guide as it does not contain the standards in its entirety. So let's look at some of the unique aspects of the guide. Throughout, there are compass icons labeled with the term recommendation. These are followed by ideas for going beyond minimum requirements to create inclusive spaces. We will explore this more later. The guide also has an animation section. It contains videos which can help with understanding and visualizing the requirements outlined in the standards. Lastly, there is a common questions section at the end of each guide that addresses frequently asked questions about the topic.
Thanks, Brianna. We have introduced 3 tools which are helpful to use when considering the accessibility of an environment. Now let's take a look at how these 3 tools can be used to complement one another.
Great idea, Brian. When using these tools together, it is important to remember, always reference the standards. For the remainder of this webinar, let's think of the standards as the head coach to a team. The standards contain the comprehensive minimum requirements to make built environments accessible and it influences the other tools. Just like a head coach calls the plays during the game and influences the entire team. The checklist and the guide have unique aspects that complement the guidance provided in the standards. The checklist provides a way to assess the environment to identify barriers, and the guide helps with describing the standards using pictures and descriptions. So let's think of these two tools as players on the team that bring unique aspects to the court.
That's a helpful analogy, Brianna. And to add to it, players look to head coaches for guidance and decision-making, like what play will be run when you are down by 2 with 15 seconds left in the game. Just like how the standards should always be referenced for guidance and decision-making when creating accessible environments.
That's right, Brian. Let's get our heads in the game and discuss more about how these two resources can be used together, starting with the checklist. The checklist can be in the starting lineup of the game as it provides helpful information for assessing an environment. The checklist can be separated into 3 main categories: prepare, evaluate, and plan. The New England ADA Center has a helpful resource titled How to Use This Checklist, which includes information on these categories. The link to this resource is included in the resource guide for this webinar. Let's start with preparing. The checklist offers downloadable copies and fillable forms of each priority area and the entire checklist. It can be helpful to plan ahead to see the number of copies needed, whether you choose to print out copies or fill it out electronically. For an example, if you have 3 on-site restrooms, printing or downloading 3 copies of Priority 3 toilet rooms may be helpful to assist with specific considerations for each room. The front page of each checklist offers a space to record information such as location, building, and date. The checklist provides ideas for tools to gather before the assessment begins, such as a tape measure and clipboard. It can be helpful to have at least 2 team members during this process. While one measures, the other can record the information and take pictures. Teamwork makes the dream work.
Brianna, let's move to conducting the evaluation. The checklist suggests starting outdoors and working your way inside, just like you are arriving at the venue as a visitor or guest. Use the checklist to take detailed notes on locations, measurements, photos, and comments.
Brian, let's take a moment to explore this further by using the parking example that I mentioned earlier. The PowerPoint slide displays a section from the checklist. It asks if parking is provided for the public, are an adequate number of accessible spaces provided? It offers an opportunity to select yes or no and a space to record the total number of parking spaces available and the number of accessible parking spaces available. There is also a table that displays how many accessible spaces are needed based on the total number of parking spaces available. Next to that is a place to input comments and reference a photo number if a picture was taken. If a barrier has been identified, it's now time to plan how to remove them. The final column offers possible solutions. This brings us to planning. Sometimes the checklist provides suggestions for possible solutions. In our example regarding the number of accessible parking spaces, one of the possible solutions offered by the checklist is to reconfigure by painting lines. This is one idea. It's important to consider all possibilities for solutions, and the checklist offers a space to record these.
Brianna, this sounds like something a head coach can help with.
You're right, Brian. The standards, as the head coach, provide solutions for identified barriers. These scoping requirements will tell you what you need and how many are needed. It also contains information on exceptions and advisories specific to certain situations and entities. This is an example of why it's important to reference the standards along with the checklist. So let's revisit our parking example and review the scoping requirements in Chapter 2 of the standards. These scoping requirements in Chapter 2 are broken into sections based on various topics. We can find information on accessible parking in Section 208, Parking Spaces. This section includes the minimum number of accessible parking spaces for facilities with 1 to 1,001 available parking spaces. It is important to note that the checklist provided information for up to 75 parking spaces. This is another example of why the standards should always be referenced when using ADA tools. This chapter also includes an advisory which describes what the term parking facility means to help ensure minimum requirements are met. For an example, the term facility is used to encompass parking lots and parking structures.
Brianna, if an organization has identified they do not have enough accessible parking spaces and are planning to add some, how do they know what to do next?
Brian, just like a head coach has several plays to choose from during a game, the standards has many chapters and sections to reference when making environments accessible. An organization can visit the technical requirements in the standards to learn about the minimum requirements for the accessible parking spaces they wish to add. Technical requirements describe how to implement something, like an accessible parking space. Chapters 3 through 10 of the standards provides these requirements, and each chapter is organized by a topic. Each chapter contains sections which organizes the information. In this case, Chapter 5, General Site and Building Elements, has a section specific to information on parking spaces. Section 502, Parking Spaces, outlines the dimensions of an accessible parking space for cars and vans, the requirements for the access aisle, required identification signs, and more. Of course, advisories and exceptions are indicated throughout the technical chapters as well.
Got it, Brianna. Time out. We have touched on 2 of the ADA tools. How is the third tool helpful?
Brian, let's face it, the standards can be highly technical. Although they do include images and charts, sometimes it's better to convey the technical information in another way. This is why we find the guide to be so helpful. It provides various ways to process the information presented in the standards. One of those ways is through animations. For example, they have an animation for parking spaces and passenger loading zones. This illustrates certain aspects of accessible parking, like where accessible parking is required, and the guidance on calculating the number of spaces needed. Let's view a portion of the Parking and Passenger Loading Zones animation from the U.S. Access Board, which provides ideas for marking access aisles with horizontal or diagonal lines and depicts an individual using a wheelchair, parking, and transferring to their wheelchair using an accessible parking space and access aisle.
The access aisle must be marked. The marking method and color is not specified in the standards, but may be addressed by state or local regulations. The access aisle provides room to transfer to and from vehicles and must be flush with the parking space. Changes in level, other than slopes up to 1 to 48, are not permitted in either the access aisle or the parking space. Curb ramps cannot intrude into any portion of the access aisle or parking space.
That is helpful, Brianna. These 3 tools each bring unique aspects to the game and work together towards a common goal, making the environment accessible. Let's bring everything together to win the game by sharing an example of how these tools can be used together to identify and overcome barriers in the environment. Let's consider a business who has a goal of making their main entrance and doors throughout the building accessible for their employees and customers. How can they use these tools, the standards, the checklist, and the guide, to identify barriers in their entrances, establish unique goals, and make a plan to achieve them?
Well, Brian, according to the scouting report, a good place to start is by using the checklist to evaluate the environment to identify barriers. Just remember to have the standards nearby for reference. The first step is to dedicate a team to use the checklist. Then have the team refer to the How to Use the Checklist section of the tool that we mentioned earlier. This will prepare the team with helpful information for assessing certain aspects of the environment, like door width and hardware. The team can reference this section before starting the evaluation and throughout it. The team can determine which priority they are going to assess. It can be all four depending on the organization's goals. Earlier in this webinar, we referenced the 4 areas. They are Priority 1, Approach and Entrance, Priority 2, Access to Goods and Services, Priority 3, Toilet Rooms, and Priority 4, Additional Access, which covers things like drinking fountains and fire alarms. Since the team is focusing on accessible entrances, Priorities 1 and 2 of the checklist can be helpful as they cover aspects of exterior and interior entrances. These priorities provide questions to help with identifying barriers, including questions about door width, door hardware, door closing speed, and more. For an example, one question asks about the clear opening width of the entrance door. Another question asks if the door is equipped with hardware that can be operated using one hand and doesn't require tight grasping, pinching, or twisting of the wrist. The team can record the information they gather, like measurements or comments, in the checklist and track photos taken of the entrances being evaluated.
Brianna, let's say the business identified their main entrance and conference room doors as having barriers to accessibility, such as width and hardware. Now what?
Well, now it's time to look at the head coach and the team for help. Let's start with the standards. Remember, these outline the minimum requirements. They can use this guidance for their main and interior entrances. The scoping and technical requirements in the standards provide specific measurements and exceptions and advisories that may apply to the business's unique environment. For example, Chapter 4 of the standards, which is called Accessible Routes, contains technical requirements for clear width, hardware, and more.
Brianna, it's great that the standards provide detailed information like specific measurements. Now, because doors have many different aspects, including width, hardware, opening force, and more, is there a tool that can be helpful to bring all these aspects together?
Yes, this is a great example of where teamwork comes to play. Remember, the 3 tools we have been discussing bring unique aspects. The checklist can help identify barriers. The standards contain technical guidance for removing barriers, and the guide is helpful because it takes the technical information and illustrates it in a way that can be helpful when removing barriers and creating access. So let's explore this. In the guide, Chapter 4 on entrances, doors, and gates contains illustrations, information, and recommendations. Let's consider an illustration provided in this chapter. The PowerPoint slide displays an illustration of a door with details about closing speed, opening force, hardware, thresholds, and more. These details are depicted using arrows, measurements, and highlighted portions. This can be helpful because it brings several aspects of door accessibility together using one illustration. It is also helpful to note the sections of the standards are referenced for each aspect of door accessibility depicted in the illustration. The team may find this illustration helpful when planning how to remove the barriers identified using the checklist. Remember, it also can be helpful to use all 3 tools when planning to overcome barriers, as they all provide examples of possible solutions, including things like altering the door, installing offset hinges, replacing door hardware, and adding automatic door openers.
Brianna, that's great. The illustrations in the guide really help me visualize door accessibility and all of the aspects it includes. The business now has identified barriers for their external and internal doorways and considered options for overcoming this barrier. Now what's left is to implement the accessibility solution. What are some considerations that come into play here?
Brian, many businesses and organizations begin to consider the process of implementation. This may include common factors such as the time frame it will take to complete the project, how much it will cost, and the impact the accessibility feature will have on the business. Every organization is unique, so these considerations will also be unique. What may be easy for one organization to implement may not be as easy for another. To help, the Accessible Ohio team created the Priority Tool and Game Plan. This is a resource which can assist organizations with these considerations using criteria ratings to help prioritize identified goals. The Priority Tool and Game Plan is a downloadable tool available on the Resources page of the Accessible Ohio website. Once downloaded, the tool becomes a fillable form. It can be used repeatedly along your accessibility journey. So let's consider how this tool can be helpful for the goal of installing automatic doors. Let's discuss two criteria referenced in the Priority Tool and Game Plan, which can impact achieving accessibility goals. The first is ease. This can include a business's internal knowledge and expertise about a topic, in this case, installing automatic doors. For example, having a maintenance staff who can install the automatic doors once the equipment is ordered. As we mentioned, each organization is unique, so the rating will vary from organization to organization. Brian, another criterion the Priority Tool provides a rating for is access to resources. This includes things like available funding or a budget for the implementation of automatic doors. Do you have ideas for this?
I sure do. There are tax incentives which may help offset related accessibility costs. It's always helpful to talk with your financial and tax professionals about the tax incentives available for making changes to create more accessible environments. The Disabled Access Credit is a credit for small businesses who incur costs associated with providing access to persons with disabilities. This credit can be taken each year there are expenses. The Barrier Removal Tax Deduction is a deduction related to the removal of architectural and transportation barriers related to the mobility of individuals with disabilities. The deduction is a maximum of $15,000 a year for qualified expenses that normally must be capitalized. Brianna, we also connect employers with Accessible Ohio specialists who can assist in identifying grants.
That's right. The funding the organization may have dedicated to accessibility enhancements or be able to obtain will affect how they rate this criterion. After the business calculates the totals for the criterion for automatic doors, they can now populate the game plan in order of these ratings. The game plan is your organization's plan for how to move forward with the goals you identified in the priority tool. It breaks down goals into short, medium, and long-term goals. Those with high ratings likely fit best into the short-term accessibility goal portion of the game plan table. These can generally be accomplished in a few weeks to a few months. Those with mid-number ratings will likely fall in the medium-term ones, which can be accomplished in a few months to a year. Finally, those with low ratings may most likely be long-term accessibility goals. These may be accomplished over an extended period, for an example, more than a year to several years. So maybe this organization has a skilled maintenance team, consulted with an Accessible Ohio specialist, but needs to find funding for this barrier removal. The business also knows this enhancement will have a highly positive impact on its visitors and guests and employees. This led them to categorizing automatic doors as a medium-term goal. From there, they can use the game plan to organize information about responsible parties, funding, and the desired time frame for completion.
Brianna, that is a great tool. If our attendees are interested in learning more about this tool, they can contact their regional Accessible Ohio specialist for assistance. All right, folks, that's the buzzer for the game. Let's review by doing a post-game interview. Julie Wood, the Accessible Ohio manager, is joining us to talk about her experience working with an employer on their accessibility goals. Welcome, Julie.
Hi, Brian.
In your previous role as a worksite accessibility specialist, you work closely with the regional business relations specialist, like me, to assist employers with their goals of making their workplace more inclusive. Do you have an example you can share with us regarding an employer using your consultative services?
I do, Brian. I had the opportunity to work with a manufacturing and distribution company who had hired an employee who uses a wheelchair, and they wanted to make sure their main entrance and the doors throughout their facility were accessible. So specifically, their goal was to make sure their manual doors throughout were accessible, and they also wanted to consider low energy options for automatically opening the main entrance door with the push of a button. So I talked with the employer first about their goals, and then I scheduled a time to go on site to observe their environment, to take pictures to reference later, and just to gather more information about their goals. When I returned to the office, then I researched guidance, best practices, looked at the tools that we're discussing today, and compiled information into a report that was really tailored to the goals that they shared with me that they had for their environment. And then when I had the report ready, I reached out to the partner or to the employer partner and shared the resources with them in the report, but also offered to schedule a time to talk with them about what that included. In that conversation, the employer did share they found that conversation to be helpful because the information is very technical. So that it was helpful for them that we reviewed that information together. And I even shared my screen with them to help them navigate into the resources to know where to find the specific information that they were looking for. We had the chance to talk through any questions that they had, and I'm happy to report that the end result was that they did install automatic door openers for both their main entrance and the doors to the lobby.
That is a great example, Julie. Thank you for sharing.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned through your consultative services, you connected this employer to the ADA tools we talked about in today's webinar. Can you expand on this?
Sure, Brian. The employer's goals were about their built environment, specifically their doors. And as we've talked about today, the information from that starts with the standards. So we went there first to discuss what their responsibilities were and help them find the information that would answer those questions. And they wanted to self-assess their environment. So we then went to the checklist and I pointed out the priority areas where they could find the questions that would help them to make those assessments, record the information they found, and identify any potential solutions. And then we brought it all together by looking at what the guide illustrates, because we know the doors have many components to them when it comes to accessibility. So we used all of the tools that we're talking about today in our conversations during the on-site visit. These are what I referenced in the report, and then in the conversation discussed with them so they could find these tools to be helpful, and they did move forward with achieving their goal of making their doors accessible.
Thank you, Julie. That is a great example. And it really puts into perspective how OOD can work with partners to meet their accessibility goals by connecting them to resources like the ADA tools.
Thank you.
Brianna, do you want to provide our audience with more information on how our audience can access our services?
Sure. The Accessible Ohio program partners with businesses, communities, venues, attractions, and employers to connect them with resources and information to support their accessibility journey. We provide consultations, deliver education, and create resources aimed at helping our partners identify their accessibility goals and plan a way to achieve them. Through these no-cost services, we connect partners to resources like the standards, the guide, and the checklist, and can link directly to the guidance related to their goals. We also provide ideas for solutions that align with accessible design and universal design. If you're interested in partnering with us or have a question, contact information can be found on the team page of our website. If you are an employer looking to diversify and strengthen your workforce by including people with disabilities, our business relations team provides a range of services and resources at no cost. These include providing candidate sourcing, hosting hiring events, and conducting disability etiquette and awareness training. The business relation team's contact information can be found on our business relations webpage, found on our website as well.
Thanks, Brianna. That brings us to the close of this webinar. Today, we introduced and identified tools which can assist in making environments accessible. We discussed the 2010 ADA standards for accessible design, the checklist for existing facilities, and the guide to ADA accessibility standards. We even briefly touched upon the priority tool and game plan of our Accessible Ohio team, created to assist entities with identifying, prioritizing, and implementing accessibility goals. We illustrated how each of these unique tools complement one another and can be used together when creating and maintaining a welcoming and inclusive environment. Lastly, we highlighted ways these tools can be used throughout workspaces and community spaces. We hope you will utilize these tools to further ensure accessibility in your environment. If you would like additional information, please reach out. We are available and happy to continue the conversation.